Hello everyone, this is David for chesslessons.com, and today I'm going to go over the game of eekinoks versus dewerter from the under 1300 section of the lichess 10-0 rated rapid. Game started with e4, grabbing space in the center, e5, and I'm only going to stop at some critical moments where I feel there are learning lessons. Knight f3, attacking this loose pawn, knight c6, defending it. So g3, I feel, is a little bit slow. It's not a bad move, but your priority in the opening is to castle. So you might want to play bishop c4, bishop b5, or even bishop e2 so that you can castle as quickly as possible. Your opponent also made a similar mistake, I would say, is that he's trying to castle as quickly as possible also, unless he wants to go maybe queenside with bishop g4 and queen d7 and castle long. But if I were your opponent, I would play something like bishop c5 or knight f6 just to try to castle as quickly as possible. So okay, you played g3. It's not fatal. It's not even a blunder. I would just put more emphasis on castling quicker to get your king to safety. You don't want to leave your king in the center. Bishop g2 is a good move. Knight f6. So when your opponent played knight f6, that should immediately ring a bell in your head saying, be careful, he's trying to grab your pawn for free, and you don't want to give away free pawns. You ignored him, he took the pawn, you're down a pawn. There's a rule. When you're down material in a chess game, you don't want to exchange pieces. So going forward in this game, you want to try to keep your pieces on the board. So you played c3. I don't like this move so much because c3 is a great square for your knight on b1. And by putting your pawn on c3, you're no longer able to put your knight on c3 because it's occupied. So if I were you, I would have played a move maybe like rook e1 or d3, kicking out this knight. And then after you kick out the knight, maybe knight to c3, where it could later on maybe jump into d5 and cause some trouble for your opponent. Okay, so after your opponent plays bishop g4, you need to keep in mind that two things. One, this is not a real pin because this bishop here is protecting this knight. And when I say not a real pin, I don't mean in the sense that you can't move your knight. I mean it in the sense that generally in these types of positions, you can't move your queen, because if you move your queen and the bishop takes, then pawn takes, you have double pawns. But in this case, because your bishop is on g2 and not a pawn, this pin is not as effective. You can even move out of the way right away. You can even play like d3. Let's say he jumps back and then queen b3, and he can't really like damage your pawn structure here by giving you double pawns, which is sometimes the intention of bishop d4. So let's go back and see what happened. You played d4. Now this square is kind of weak for you, this d4 square. Why? Because a pinned piece, the knight is pinned now because the queen is behind it, is not a good defender. So one of the reasons we put our knights on f3 is to defend the d4 square. In this case, because your knight is pinned, if a bunch of trades happen on d4, the d4 square is vulnerable. As we'll see in this game, a couple of trades did take place. And at this point, before he captured on d2, even at this point, your opponent could have just jumped in right here. Let's go back a little bit. Instead of castling, let's say, he could have just jumped in and grabbed this piece for free, because you can't take back because you're pinned. So a pinned piece is not a good defender. In this case, the pinned piece is the knight. What it's defending, it's a defender of the d4 square, which is under attack by the knight on c6. Okay, so you traded some pieces on d2. You lost another pawn. And over here, you played h3, which I think is a good move. And And your opponent totally missed that. Your opponent, maybe he thought he's doing a heroic sacrifice. What he should have done is probably just moved back over here or taken this piece because his knight is hanging here. So he could have maybe just like, after you went to h3, pawn to h3, he could just capture you. And then let's say you captured with your, you can't capture with your queen because the knight is here. But let's say after you captured with your bishop, yeah, he could have just played regular chess, maybe something like f5, or this piece is kind of loose, and loose pieces drop off. So maybe you could go to like knight d6, knight e6. Sorry about that. But okay, so your opponent made a mistake, gave you a free piece. You played really nicely and took advantage of the free piece. And notice how your opponent, he only spent 2 seconds to recapture the pawn. So in general, just because you got captured doesn't mean you should be so quick to recapture and spend 2 seconds on a move. Generally, you should spend, in a 10-10 game, at least 10 seconds on a move. What your opponent didn't realize is that his knight is hanging here, and capturing this pawn is not as important as playing, let's say, knight to e6, or maybe even trading over here. But at this point in the game, your opponent is down material and he shouldn't want to trade, so knight e6 would be the better move. But he went into automated recapture mode, and you took advantage of that very nicely. Knight takes, and now from this point, your opponent should worry about you trading queens because you're up material, and he should move his queen away so that he can have drawing chances or a chance to trick you later in the game. But instead, he just plays f5, and when you're down material as your opponent is down material, you did the right thing. You traded queens. So it shows that you have a deeper understanding than your opponent. So here's where the game got a little bit messy. And if you look at the time, you have 9 minutes. He has 7:55. So there's no need to rush. You take the free pawn. He attacks your knight. You take another free pawn. He attacks your rook. You get out of the way. Excellent job. And now here you panicked a little bit. He's attacking your knight. So you have to move your knight to a square that's not attacked. One square that's not attacked is potentially b3. If you move your knight to b3, he can't capture you here because you'll capture back. Another option is called simplifying into a winning endgame. So in this case, if you played knight to e6, forking his 2 rooks, you're actually giving up 6 points, a bishop, and a knight for 5 points, which is the rook, but you're transposing into a winning endgame where these 2 rooks will dominate this 1 rook, and you'll win the game with proper play. So in general, you don't want to play a move like knight e6 if it's going to trade 2 minor pieces for a rook, because 1 rook is 5 points and 2 minor pieces are 6 points. But if you're up a lot of material and you're going to be able to transpose into a winning endgame, then you do want to do that. Okay, so let's see what happened. Instead, you blundered your knight. Not the end of the world. You're still up an entire bishop, so you can play a move maybe like bishop to e3 or bishop to c3 and slow play this position. There's a concept in chess that you don't need to win the one game, meaning when you're ahead a lot, you can chill. You don't have to put too much effort in winning the game. You just want to be careful and not blunder your pieces. So let's see how this game went. You played bishop to g5, attacking his rook on d8. Good move. He came back down and attacked your loose piece. Now, when your opponent attacks a loose piece is defined as a piece on a square that's not defended. What you want to do is move that piece to a square such as e3 that is defended. But what you did here is a little bit too materialistic. Instead, you took another free pawn, not realizing that he has a tactic here. Now, this tactic is called removing the guard. This rook on h5 is defending this bishop on g5. And by playing g6, he's trying to remove the guard of the bishop and capture it for free. Now, when you're in a bad situation, what you don't want to do is make the situation worse by ignoring it. So the question you have to ask yourself is, which piece do you want to save? Do you want to save the rook or the bishop? You can't save both, unfortunately, but you have to choose the option that's going to cause the least amount of damage. Now, the rook is worth more than the bishop. So if you escape, let's say you play rook to h4 in this case, you'll lose your bishop, but this is still an even endgame. 2 rooks versus 2 rooks, and you can still battle it out, and the player who plays more precise will win. But in this case, I guess you kind of panicked, and sometimes when people panic in these positions, they kind of make a not so bad situation really bad. So you panicked, you played rook d1, and he took the better of the 2 pieces, which is smart. He took the 5 points, which is the rook, instead of the 3 points. And now the same concept. You still have this problem of your bishop is hanging, and it's a loose piece because nothing is defending it. And like we said, LPDO, loose pieces drop off. And what you want to do is move it maybe to this square, to h4, or maybe you want to even move it to e3, or even, e7 wouldn't be so bad because the rook is defending it. That's not so economic, though. You don't want to defend a bishop worth 3 points with a rook worth 5 points because you want to keep your rook free to move around. So maybe e3 would have been the best. Instead, you go for this check. And now your opponent does something smart. He attacks 2 pieces. 1 piece is already attacked, and he attacks a second piece. And maybe you can get out of this by playing rook to e7, check, threatening to take this piece, the pawn on b7, which is hanging. And maybe your opponent can go to king g6, attacking this bishop instead, so that you don't have time to take this pawn because you have to move this bishop to, let's say, f4, in which case he can run away here to b5, but then this rook can still grab the pawn on a7. But instead, I guess you panicked here again, and you ran away to a8, which is not the most active square for a rook, and your opponent took another free piece. So I hope this was helpful analysis. I hope you learned something from it. And I hope you can use these principles and ideas to improve on your future games.